about and that we're going to try to answer here to some degree. Number one, what does the Bible say? And then we want to look at, well, what does the Spirit of Prophecy say? And then I want to look at why does it matter and what does it mean for us, okay? And in the Bible, there's not a lot of explicit statements on this. You know, it's not 100% clear, but there are some scriptures that are very shed light on the issue. There's two in particular that I'd like to point to that are quite clear. And I would submit to you that typology would probably provide some more answers if we spent some time looking at that. But Matthew 24, this is the big one, right? Because we have this warning here in Matthew 24 that's probably the most explicit one. Jesus says, if any man shall say to you, lo, here's the Christ, or there, believe it not, right? So here's a false Christ. It's plain as day. And Jesus tells us, believe it not, for his lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. And so in this scripture, we can see two things. Number one, there is a false Christ that's coming, and we should watch for it. But two, his coming is going to be different than Christ's coming, right? The counterfeit is not going to be identical to Christ's coming or the way that it's supposed to happen. Otherwise, he wouldn't tell us that, his coming is going to be different. Now, you will want to open up to Matthew 24. I'm going to walk through it a little bit, and you can kind of follow along. But Matthew 24, I would submit to you, is chronological, and there's evidence for this in the text itself. When you look at Matthew 24, you'll find a little word that appears over and over and over again, and it's the word then, right? So in English, we understand then. If I say, well, I'm going to the store, and then I'm going to stop by the church, and then I'm going to head home, you understand that I'm giving you an order of events, right? I'm telling you a sequence. Matthew 24, Jesus uses the word then very much. He says, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains, and then if any man say, right, so it's a sequence that he presents. And if we go to the Greek, which you can do with a Bible app or something, and we look at the Greek word that's used here for the word then, we can find that it's the Greek word tote, right? Strong's G5119. And Thayer's Greek lexicon tells us that this word is used by way of transition from one thing mentioned to another which could not take place before it. Right? So it's definitely a transitory or, a sequential type of word. It's giving us an order or a sequence. And some example verses, I just throw a slew up here. We're going to look at them kind of point by point where you find this word used. And if we take the time and plot where we find this word and kind of break up Matthew 24, we can find sections of time that give us a sequence of events. Matthew 24, we're going to divide it up by the word then here. So verses 4 to 8, let me see how much reading I can do. Matthew 24, verses 4 to 8, Jesus says, take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not what? It's not yet, right? So here's the beginning of sorrows, as Jesus says. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in various places. So all over the place. These are worldwide in scale. And then he says that at the beginning of sorrows. So here's a period of time, the beginning of sorrows, when we see these things start to escalate on a worldwide scale, right? Natural disasters, pestilences, wars. Maybe that sounds familiar to you. Maybe you watch the news. And then verse 9. He says, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And there's kind of a link here that's going on. I wish we could do a full exposition of Matthew 24, but I don't have time for that. But then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted. Why? Well, they're looking at the wars, rumors of wars, the pestilences, the natural disasters, and then they begin to say, well, wait, we think these people are responsible. We think it's their fault. And so, as a response, they blame God's people. And God's people fall under persecution. And persecution begins. And then, verse 10, we see these things start to happen as persecution comes against God's people. He says, and then, right, once persecution comes, many shall be offended. That is, they're going to stumble. They're going to fall into sin. They're going to walk out of the church. Many shall be offended. They shall betray one another. They shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise. Now, prophet speaks for who? It speaks for God. And false prophets, do they arise in the church or outside of the church? It's interesting. It's a mix, isn't it? But largely, by and by, it's in the church. You know, false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved, right? And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached unto all the world for a witness unto the nations, and then the end shall come, right? So here's a period of time, right? Persecution comes as a response to the escalating natural disasters, trouble in the world, and then shaking. We see a shaking taking place in the church, false teachers rising up. We see lawlessness and the teaching of lawlessness. We see the preaching of the gospel to every nation, and we see martyrdom taking place at this time. But the next passage, verses 15 to 20, Jesus says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So here's the next step in the sequence, right? The abomination of desolation. And let him which is on the housetop come not down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. In verse 20, pray that your flight's not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath. For then, right, following the abomination of desolation shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So this is the worst time of trouble ever read about in the history of the world. I believe there's been some partial fulfillments of this in the past, and that Matthew 24 is layered. But pertaining to the end of time, we're looking at that time of trouble, that great time of trouble that happens when Michael stands up. We read about in Daniel chapter 12. An interesting thought, by the way, is that both Elijah and Elisha, which represent that message at the end of time, they were blamed for natural disasters which came about and were persecuted by the church-state union of their day as a response to that. And something to note here is that this abomination of desolation, we understand that to be a Sunday law enforced by law, right? The union of church and state in the United States of America and the legislation and enforcement of a Sunday law. And so this is what we're looking for, right? The abomination of desolation is established. Church and state have come together. They begin to pass laws forcing people to transgress God's law. And when this happens, following this, we see that the time of trouble follows. And that would be the close of probation and the 7 last plagues and all of those things happening. So, continuing on, verses 21 to 22, we read, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of this world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days should be shortened. Following this, right, we have the close of probation, the 7 last plagues. But following this, Jesus gives us this warning then, right? Which is another sequence. So the great tribulation, time of trouble, and then we have a warning to watch out for a false Christ at that time. Then, if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is the Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they will deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus gives us a specific warning of a false Christ at this time, right, in the sequence that we're looking at. Verse 29, we see signs in the heavens, which he gives a definite time frame. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, The powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Right? So following this false Christ impersonation, we see that the tribulation comes to a close. There's signs in the heavens, and then there's the sign of the coming of the Son of Man, and Jesus comes. So we have our sequence. Of course, verse 30, Christ's coming. And just to establish another point from Revelation, Revelation 14, if you want to look at that, it talks about the wrath of God. Revelation 14, we see the last message of warning going out into the world through the three angels, which represent a movement under God's people. And then we hear, we'll reread in verse 14 of Revelation 14, I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle, right? So we have the coming of Christ represented after these messages go out into the world. And then in verse 17, another angel comes out of the temple, which is in heaven, having a sharp sickle. It says he has power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of what? The wrath of God. So here we have the wrath of God being poured out. In Revelation 15, shows us the same thing. We see the wrath of God. Verse 7, one of the four beasts, in Revelation 15, one of the four beasts gave unto the seven angels 7 golden vials full of what? The wrath of God. Here's the wrath of God to be poured out, who liveth forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Now, why is it significant that the smoke fills the temple before the wrath of God is poured out? What does that mean, that the smoke fills the temple? There's no more prayers. There's no more intercession, right? Intercession ceases. And then those vials begin to be poured out. And so this is the close of probation that's shown to us in Revelation 15. And then in Revelation 16, as part of the sequence, we begin to read about the 7 last plagues. That's those vials being poured out after probation is closed, right? And this is where it gets interesting. So parallel to this, consider the days of Noah, right? Noah, he went into the ark. The door was shut by an angel. And then the flood came immediately the same day. No? Oh, when did the flood come? 7 days later, right? So that's interesting, right? Because life for most people continued as normal. In fact, they were probably throwing tomatoes at the ark and laughing, ha, 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 right? Having a good old time. And Noah, this crazy guy, he's up in the ark with a bunch of stinky animals. And they went about their way for 7 days until rain began to fall from the sky. And they realized they had made a terrible mistake. So the close of probation came, but there was some time before those plagues began to fall. And I think we'll see that the same thing. Probation's going to close. You can read it in the Great Controversy. People won't know. They're not going to be aware that probation is closed. It's going to be a surprise for most people. And they're going to find out only when it's too late that there's no more time left for them to do anything. But here's the question. After which plague does Christ come? You have 7 last plagues. After which one does Christ come? Right. We would expect the 7th, right? He either is the 7th plague or he's after the 7th plague, right? So, therefore, the plagues take place before Jesus comes, but after the close of probation. It's fairly simple, but it's nice to think it through sometimes, right? But that being the case, then I would submit to you that the logical conclusion is that the events that we read about under the 6th plague take place after the close of probation, but before Jesus is coming, after the 5th plague, but before the 7th, right? And this is what we read in Revelation 16, 12 through 14. This is the 6th plague here. It says, the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Now, symbolically, the river Euphrates fed Babylon and sustained her. And we read about in Revelation 17 the waters that Babylon sits on, right? It represents peoples and nations, multitudes and tongues. So here's the support of Babylon being withdrawn, right? People are turning away from her. They're not happy with her. They don't want to support her. Her waters are being dried up. She's losing support. That way God's message can go in and be effective. In verse 13, we see Satan's response, right? So Babylon's losing support. People aren't happy. Plagues are falling. They're like, no, we're going to abandon this system. But Satan does something to make sure that that doesn't happen. It says, I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of what? Devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. So here is the events of the 6th plague, and there's an intimation here, right? This is the final thrust in Satan's whole plan of deception and his whole mode of operation. This is the last chance he's got. The 6th plague, 7th plague is coming, Christ is coming. This is his last shot at winning this controversy, right? And so he throws everything at it. All this starts to happen right there at the end. And then we read this text. Jesus says, behold, I come as a thief. I find this really interesting because we're reading the 6th plague. We see Satan's last chance, his last-ditch effort. And then Jesus, almost as like a contrast to what's happening there, says, behold, I come as a thief, as if to say, hey, the imposter comes, but I'm coming as a thief, right? Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And so here is a time when the saints, do they have garments or do they not have garments? They have garments. They have to keep them, right? So they've been given those white garments, and Jesus says, hey, watch out and make sure you don't lose them, right? That's very different than pray and look for those garments to be given to you. It's, no, you've received those garments, don't lose them. Don't stain them, which implies that God's people are sealed, right? They've received that robe of righteousness, and they've been sealed and prepared for Christ to come. And Jesus says, hold on, don't let go of those garments. There's one last thing you got to go through. So here's a question that I've received many, many times that I had myself. Why would Satan try to deceive after probation is closed? I'm not going to answer this question fully, but I want to bring it up and point out a couple things, right? It's kind of the wrong question in a way, because if we look at the Bible, it's not really a question of whether Satan does or does not deceive after probation closes or attempts to deceive. He does, and the Bible tells us this. There's 3 texts in particular, and one of them that you haven't seen yet, that point to Satan deceiving after probation is closed. One is in Matthew 20:24, right? We read about the abomination of desolation, and then we see that great time of trouble, which points to the last plagues and all of those things, and the false impersonation of Christ, right? So Satan working miracles, personating Christ, following the close of probation. Revelation 16, we just looked at this, right? The 6th plague. There's deception that's taking place in the 6th plague, and we've placed it firmly after the close of probation, but before Christ's coming. And Revelation 20, this is another one. After the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go out to do what? To deceive the nations. Well, isn't it over? You just sat on your butt for 1,000 years, thinking about what you've done and the fact that you've lost, but now you're going to go out and try to deceive again? What are you going to accomplish, right? So me as a believer, I believe the Bible, I believe God, and I say, okay, probation closes, why don't you just give up, right? It's over, you lost. But Satan doesn't think that way, right? He doesn't just give up. In fact, after 1,000 years to think about it, he still thinks he's got a shot. And he goes out and tries to deceive. So it's not a question of whether he does or not. It's just, what is he thinking? Why? And that's a lost mind, I guess. So now I want to take a minute and look at some text from the Spirit of Prophecy. with you. And a few things that I like to share, at least my mentality going into this kind of study. Well, one, of course, this is not exhaustive. I'm sharing the most compelling statements, which give definite clues to the timing. And I emphasize that, the timing. This is what I was looking at and looking for. When I read a statement, I want to see, well, okay, this statement talks about the event, but does it give me definite answers or clues about the timing? Or is it just giving me information about the event itself and not when it happens? And you can set aside a lot of statements when you look at them and say, well, what does this say about the timing? And you realize, oh, well, this doesn't really give me a time frame. So I can move it over here and look for, where are those statements that give me a time frame? I stress this, and I recommend you do this with every statement I share, is go back and read it in the full context and the original context. There's a lot of light when you do this. It's very helpful. Line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. Why do I say this? Or why do I share this? Well, when we study the Bible, do we take a text from one place and then say, hey, it says over here that absent from the body, present with the Lord, so when we die, we go to heaven, right? Do we do that? No. We take all of the statements from all of Scripture, right? Here a little, there a little. We bring them together. Everything that talks about a particular subject. And there's going to be statements that seem to be outliers. And do we go with the outlier statements and ignore the rest of them? Or do we take the weight of evidence and then we go to the outliers and say, well, how do I fit these back into the picture? Because these are the more clear statements, the wider statements, right? Of course. So that's kind of what we want to make sure we're doing with the Spirit of Prophecy. Same thing. Get all the statements together that talk about a subject and look at them all together and then make a decision from there. Be careful not to just grab things out of their context and that kind of thing. And two questions that I found myself thinking about, two questions to consider. Of course, does the text provide information regarding the timing in this particular event or this particular case? Maybe you're asking a different question, but does this give me answers? And does the context indicate an indirect agency? What do I mean by that? Well, this is what I found happens a lot in the way we talk and in the Spirit of Prophecy and even in the Bible. Practical example, building a house. Right? If I come to you and I say, oh yeah, me and my wife, we just built a house this past summer. Is your first thought that she and I picked up hammers and nails and tools and lumber and went out there and framed up a house? Or is your first thought that we hired a contractor? Hired a contractor, right? But I said we built a house. You see what I'm saying? That's an indirect agency that's implied but not stated, okay? The Bible does this in Revelation 12, for instance, using symbolism. The dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. Well, let me ask you, when the Messiah was born, was Satan standing there himself with sword in hand or with teeth exposed, ready to eat Jesus? No. And was he operating, personally to destroy Jesus? Or was he using an indirect agency? Who was that indirect agency? Herod, right? The Roman power, which is also fitly represented by the dragon, as you find in Daniel 7, right? So Satan was working through an agency, but guess who gets the credit? Satan. He was the one doing it, right? So if you ask your child to go and steal something from the store, who's responsible? Yeah. You get the blame. So when we read that someone is accomplishing something or that Satan is accomplishing something, we must be careful to consider the context to determine how the things are being accomplished. Because you might say, well, Satan goes out to deceive, but how does he do it? Does he go personally, or is there an agency that he's using to do that? And you see this particularly in the chapter that comes before the chapter titled The Time of Trouble in the Great Controversy. So if you read that, you can see an example of this. So some statements, and I start with this one from early writings because it helps to establish a sequence of events which we've already established from the Bible. She writes in early writings, I saw that the 4 angels would hold the 4 winds until Jesus' work was done in the sanctuary. So the 4 winds aren't let loose until Jesus' work is done, but then will come the 7 last plagues. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. They thought we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and that if they could rid the earth of us, the plagues would then be stayed. Then we see a decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. And I want you to remember that. Burn it into your brain. This was the time of Jacob's trouble. Then all the saints cried out with anguish of spirit and were delivered by the voice of God. Do you see the sequence? Michael stands up, probation closes, the winds are let loose. Strife starts to hit. Then we see the wicked. They see the plagues and all the things that are happening, and they blame the righteous. Okay? The saints are crying out for deliverance at this time, and they're tested. This was the time of Jacob's trouble. He wrestled with God. There was a test that takes place, but ultimately they're delivered by the voice of God. Praise God. And for further reading, do go see that. Those passages are really helpful. So, this quote I find to be the most compelling, and if you don't do this with any others, I encourage you to go read the whole manuscript here. This is a really good manuscript. I think it's the most compelling. And whenever you see the ellipses, I've left everything in correct order, but I've skipped some things just to truncate. Let's read. Satan sees that he's about to lose his case, right? He cannot sweep in the whole world. He makes one more last desperate effort to overcome who? The faithful by deception. So who's his target? Yeah, he's got everybody else, but these won't submit. And now he's got this one last desperate effort. It's the words used here, the adjectives, it's interesting, right? What does that imply? It's last chance. He clothes himself with the garments of royalty, which have been accurately described in the visions of John. He has power to do this. He will appear to his deluded followers, the Christian world, who received not the love of the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness, transgression of the law, as Christ coming the second time. And then he comes and pronounces a blessing. It says the blessing is pronounced by this false Christ upon the worshipers of the beast and his image, the people who have received the mark of the beast and the mark of the image of the beast. So has the mark of the beast been enforced when he does this? Yeah. Have people already received it? Yes. And then he comes and pronounces a blessing upon them. Jesus is looking from his throne upon his people. His interest is identified with his suffering brethren. With joy, the angel hears the words from Jesus, "Take away the filthy garments from him and clothe him with change of raiment." Here's that garment to hold on to, right? But it's given to God's people. He says, "Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with a change of raiment." Satan sees that he's about to lose his last chance of subverting these souls, and he brings all the powers of his satanic generalship into intense activity. The last great act in the drama is personating Jesus Christ. All right, and then we have this. One effort more, same quote. Then Satan's which device? Last device is employed. He hears what? The unceasing cry for Christ to come, for Christ to deliver them. You remember we read that in early writings? At time of Jacob's trouble. This last strategy, now here's motive, what he's trying to accomplish. This last strategy is to personate Christ and make them think that their prayers are answered. And so the saints, right, they're expecting the time is here that Christ should come, and they're pleading for Jesus to come. And Satan comes at the last moment, at the last inch of time, to deceive them and make them think that he's the second coming of Christ and that their prayers have been answered. Right? Interesting. Last day events, I write this note here. It has a lot of statements about the Satan's false appearing of Christ, as Christ, but there's only really two that I found in there that indicate timing at all. If you go back and read context, you may find a couple others. But this statement I found really interesting, so I want to share it. She writes, "A power from beneath is working to bring about the last great scenes in the drama. Satan coming as Christ and working with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in those who are binding themselves together in secret societies." Now, what's the hint at the time frame in this statement? I underlined it for you. It says last, right? So it's just what does the word last mean? I have to ask myself that question. Which, we say Jesus is coming soon, so there's some room for that. But another statement that I was really surprised to find was in Patriarchs and Prophets. This book goes over really the first 5 books of the Bible, but interesting here, I would find a statement about the coming of Christ, Satan deceiving as the coming of Christ before the second advent in that book. But she writes, Paul, in his second letter to the Thessalonians, points to the special working of Satan in spiritualism as an event to take place when? Immediately before the second advent. What does the word immediately mean? Like just before, right? Speaking of Christ's second coming, he declares that it is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. That is, Satan has a counterfeit for Christ's coming. This harmonizes with our understanding of the 6th plague, right? You imagine God's people counting, right? Plague number 1, plague number 2, plague number 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And they're saying, oh, it's time. It's time for Jesus to come. And then what better time for Satan, if he wants to deceive the very elect, to come and then pretend to be Christ, right? That's when they would receive him the most readily. The great controversy, the chapter, the time of trouble. Now, of course, this begins with Michael standing up, and it, I believe, unfolds the events of the time of trouble, which in early writings we saw the time of trouble. She placed it after probation closes, the plagues begin to fall, and then we have a death decree going against God's people, and this is the time of Jacob's trouble, she says. And so this chapter is expanding upon that time. And she writes this, when he leaves the sanctuary, darkness covers the inhabitants of the earth. Here's smoke filling the temple in heaven. In that fearful time, the righteous must live in the sight of a holy God without an intercessor. Now, if you don't have an intercessor, what does that mean? Like, can you sin and then go get forgiveness? No, you're in trouble, right? But the saints of God are sealed at that time. We might talk about a little bit what that means. But the restraint which has been upon the wicked is removed. The winds are let loose. And Satan has entire control of the finally impenitent. God's long-suffering has ended. The world has rejected his mercy, despised his love, and trampled upon his law. The wicked have passed the boundary of their what? Probation. Probation is closed for the wicked. The Spirit of God, persistently resisted, has at last been withdrawn. Unsheltered by divine grace, they have no protection from the wicked one. Satan will what? Then plunge the inhabitants of the earth into that one great final trouble. Right? So following that close of probation, Satan, the winds are let loose. He's allowed to work with a degree that he has not been permitted in the past. And it's called this one great final trouble, or that great time of trouble such as never has been and never will be, as Jesus says in Matthew 24. As the angels of God cease to hold in check the fierce winds of human passion, all the elements of strife will be let loose. The whole world will be involved in a ruin more terrible than that which came upon Jerusalem of old. She writes this, Jacob's night of anguish, when he wrestled in prayer for deliverance from the hand of Esau, represents the experience of God's people in the time of trouble. As Satan influenced Esau to march against Jacob, so he will stir up the wicked to destroy God's people in the time of trouble. And as he accused Jacob, he will urge his accusations against the people of God. He numbers the world as his subjects, but the little company who keep the commandments of God are resisting his supremacy. If he could blot them from the earth, his triumph would be complete. He sees that holy angels are guarding them, and he infers that their sins have been pardoned, but he does not know that their cases have been decided in the sanctuary above. Did you catch that? Satan, looking at the situation, says to himself, their sins have been pardoned. They've been blotted out. Their cases are done. He doesn't know this, but he guesses that. And so he gets to work, right? He thinks they're sealed, therefore he acts, is what she's saying here. He doesn't know it, but he thinks it, and therefore he works even harder. I find that really interesting. Had not Jacob, remember this, had not Jacob previously repented of his sin and obtaining the birthright by fraud, God would not have heard his prayer and mercifully preserved his life. So in the time of trouble, if the people of God had unconfessed sins to appear before them while tortured with fear and anguish, they would be overwhelmed. Despair would cut off their faith, and they could not have confidence to plead with God for deliverance. But while they have a deep sense of their unworthiness, they have no concealed wrongs to reveal. Their sins have gone beforehand to judgment and have been blotted out, and they cannot bring them to remembrance. What a promise. You can read that again in Hebrews 10. Paul talks about, if the sins had been purged, there would be no conscious of them, right? You wouldn't be able to remember them, and that's the experience that God's people are having at this time. That they're pleading, and they see their unworthiness and their shame and their filthiness, but they've repented of those sins. They've given them to Christ, and now they're receiving the promise. Those sins have been blotted out, and they can't even remember them, right? As they're going into this crisis. That's amazing. But there's a warning in it, too, that if we come to this time of trouble with sins that are unconfessed and unrepented of, they will torture us, and we will not have any recourse, and that's going to be a miserable experience. I don't want that. I don't want that for anyone. But then she says this, following these things, fearful sights of a supernatural character will soon be revealed in the heavens, in token of the power of miracle-working demons. The spirits of devils will go forth to the kings of the earth and to the whole world to fasten them in deception and urge them on to unite with Satan in his last struggle against the government of heaven. Now, what passage does that sound like? Does it sound like the sixth plague? It's almost a direct quote. She says, by these agencies, rulers and subjects will be alike deceived. Persons will arise pretending to be Christ himself and claiming the title and worship which belong to the world's Redeemer. So are there other false Christs at this time as well? Yeah, it's not just Satan. They will perform wonderful miracles of healing and will profess to have revelations from heaven contradicting the testimony of the Scriptures. As the crowning act, what is the crowning act? It's the climax, right? It's the tip. It's the pinnacle. As the crowning act in the great drama of deception, Satan himself will personate Christ. The church has long professed to look to the Savior's advent as the consummation of her hopes. Now the great deceiver will make it appear that Christ has come. In different parts of the earth, Satan will manifest himself among men as a majestic being of dazzling brightness, resembling the description of the Son of God given by John in the Revelation. Remember, we read that he comes in response to the prayers of the saints in that death decree that had been issued, and trying to deceive who? God's people, the very elect, right? And then she writes this, furthermore, Satan is not permitted to counterfeit the manner of Christ's advent. The Savior has warned his people against deception upon this point, and has clearly foretold the manner of his second coming. There shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So she quotes that statement as pointing back to Satan's personation of Christ. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he's in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he's in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. This coming, there is no possibility of counterfeiting. It will be universally known, witnessed by the whole world. So now we'll get to the question that burns on everybody's mind. Why? What is he trying to accomplish? When we look at the question of why, one thing that comes to mind is Pharaoh, because it's typologically the same situation, right? We have God coming to deliver his people from their bondmaster, and he starts sending plagues to show Pharaoh that he's serious. But does Pharaoh repent? No. Does he give up? Right? God has already decided, hey, Egypt, you're done. I'm taking my people, we're going. But Pharaoh still resists. And even when you think about it, the death of the firstborn has happened, and God's people have gone, and there's nothing left in Egypt. All their crops are gone, all their wealth, everything is just totally taken from them. They've got nothing. Pharaoh still hardens his heart and thinks it's a good idea to go chase after the Israelites, that he's going to get them back, right? I mean, you would think he would accept defeat at that point and just give up, but he doesn't. He's just so stuck on it. And I think Satan is the same way, right? He will not accept defeat no matter what. And that's just where his mind is. I have to say that even Pharaoh went up to, he watched the waters part and God's people walking through the midst of the sea, and he went up to the edge of that, looking at these walls of water, and he says to himself, I'm going to go in there. Like, I just don't get it. But here's I think this is the biggest insight that I had. I had to wrestle with a friend over this, because he was burning on this question when I'm like, well, I think the evidence points this way, but he's like, yeah, but why? There's got to be some bigger meaning, some bigger issue, something that we're not seeing. And I'm like, why are you stuck on this? But that conversation helped me to see it too, and that's Satan wants to prove God wrong, right? That's his goal from the beginning. He said, I'm right, God's wrong. I should be in charge, God should not be in charge, right? And so we think of Job's situation as an example of this great controversy where God says, well, Job's perfect. He's righteous and upright. Shouldn't he be in charge? And Satan says, I think you're wrong, right? God said Job was perfect, but Satan said, I think you're wrong. And God said, well, then show me, right? You've got an opportunity. Go test Job and see if I'm right or not, right? And at the end of time, we're looking at the same situation where God has said, he's placed his seal upon his people, and he said, these are perfect, these are mine. I'm taking them to heaven. And Satan says, no, they're not. You can't take them. If you take them, you have to take me. They'll sin in heaven. They're not perfect, right? And God says, well then, here's your opportunity. Why don't you prove me wrong? Show me I'm wrong. And so if Satan can get just one person who's been sealed by God, God has said they're perfect, they're done, I'm taking them to heaven. If God can get one of those people to sin, just one, then guess what? He's proved God wrong. And the resurrection of the dead is called into question. God cannot resurrect a single soul if one person who's been sealed sins. And why? Because God's judgment was wrong. God said that person was perfect. He said he was taking them to heaven. He said they were done. But then Satan got them to sin. And so if God was wrong about that person, well, what about the rest of them? And what about all the ones that are in the grave? What about Moses and Elijah if he gave them 10 more years? Would they sin too? It brings the whole controversy back to the very beginning. And the entire plan of salvation is defeated. Because God was wrong. And if God was wrong about that, what else is God wrong about? Right? And so this is Satan's best shot. All he has to do is get one person who's been sealed to sin, and he wins the great controversy. So the stakes, rather than being lower because probation is closed, they're much more higher, right? Because everything is on the line. If Satan gets one of God's children to sin, but probation is still open and they still have an intercessor, then can they not just go to their intercessor and receive pardon and forgiveness and cleansing and then be saved? But if they have no intercessor and Satan gets them to sin, everything is lost. Everything. And so this is what I found as the big picture, kind of why this makes sense for me, is that the stakes are so high. And we keep saying, God's people are sealed, God's people are sealed, God's people are sealed. But what does that mean? And by that question, I want to point to a specific issue, and that is, does the sealing mean that they cannot sin, that they have lost their free will and it's been taken away and they have no ability to choose to disobey God? Or does it mean that God has declared that they will not sin and they will never choose to ever again, but they still have free will intact, right? That's going to determine probably which side of this discussion you're on, which way you think about that subject. Because if you think sealing is like a more of a Calvinistic perspective of they no longer have free will and they'll never sin because they can't, well, then yeah, of course, Satan could never, why would he ever try to do this after the close of probation? It doesn't make sense, right? But if you think that sealing means that, well, they still could, but they never will choose to, then, we see a different side of the picture. And just a question, do you believe in free will? You know? Jesus, could he have sinned, or was he, unable to? Why would Satan tempt him if he couldn't? And this issue starts to step on a lot of different subjects that we could talk about, the nature of Christ and predestination, so many things. But what does this mean for us practically? Okay, so we're looking at this subject. It's a niche subject. It's kind of hard. We have to look around. But how is this practical? And I'd like to apply it by pointing to the issue at stake, right? So if we have this picture that God's judgment is on trial, God's judgment is being tested, and God's people are being tested, but they don't have recourse. They don't have forgiveness available anymore. They've got to be right. They've got to be right with God. Then, number one, God is staking everything on this last group of people, right? The plan of salvation, it doesn't depend on them, but God's staking everything on them because they're a demonstration of what he has done and is able to do. So it's really God that everything points at, but all the stakes are at play. And the real challenge is not like, okay, how well can I identify a false prophet from a true prophet? But it's, have I so submitted to God that my character has been prepared for such a situation as this, right? There's not going to be an outward, visible, we all like action movies where things are exploding and blowing up and, you're running for your life and, I'm going to, by the sweat of my brow and my boots, get up in the hills and save myself. No, it's, probation comes as a surprise. The closing of probation comes as a surprise. And my character, at that point, it's settled, Am I right with God? Have I allowed him to change me and so fill me that I am his and I am sealed and I won't sin against him? Or have I been twiddling my thumbs and wasting time, and is my character now beyond the chance of ever improving, right? And like in the days of Noah, that door closed. It comes as a surprise. And so I need to be focused on character development and getting right with Christ, As much as it's important to study the signs of the times and the things going on around me and the events unfolding, yes, absolutely, but where am I spiritually? Do I know God? Does he know me? And would he confess me before the angels? And also, we've got to know the Bible, and we have to look for, the abomination of desolation. Again, we have to understand and believe the Scripture, and that's going to be tested whether we believe the Bible or not. And so I should be focused here, and we have to be ready now. I can't look for some event like Satan impersonating Christ to then say, oh, things are getting hot, I better get serious, right? Because it's too late. When that happens, it's too late. You wasted your time. You don't have an opportunity anymore. And I'm sorry, so it becomes a big deal. It's a really heart-wrenching thing to think about. And this is the last thing I want to share. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates to the city. This is a promise for us, so cling to it. This has been the same for everyone throughout all of time, and God's looking to prepare people and fix their character so that he can raise them up and take them with him, or that they might not even see death and get to go without passing into the grave with him and eat from the tree of life. Just picture that for a minute. Can you imagine the day when you get to take fruit from the tree of life with everybody there and bite it? Come on. So anyways, I'll close with that, and